In January 2021, FDA published the proposed traceability rule required by FSMA. And on or before November 7th, 2022, that rule is finally required to become final. So what does this mean to food businesses? I am your TAG Talks host, Lisa Lupo, and today I'm talking with TAG's Food Safety Director, Eric Edmunds, about the anticipated final rule and what we may be able to expect. Good afternoon, Eric.
Hey, Lisa. Good to be here.
Thank you for joining us today. So to refresh everyone's mind on this, can you provide a brief summary of the proposed rule and discuss the requirements that we expect to be in the final?
Yeah, so the traceability rule, it's a FSMA-based rule, so it's section 204 of FSMA. It just wasn't quite as high priority as some of the other 7 foundational rules of FSMA. The FDA is definitely putting a big focus on it right now. And the gist of the rule is essentially that section 204 of FSMA required the FDA to create a list of what they call high-risk foods in the statute. And the FDA went through and kind of reviewed past outbreaks and foodborne illnesses and the frequency and the severity of those type of outbreaks and created a list of foods that they are calling now the food traceability list. So that's what the foods that are required to have records under this rule. So the list is fairly well known, I guess, in terms of the usual culprits, the things that we see often in the news for outbreaks. So soft cheeses, shell eggs, nut butters, a lot of fresh fruits and vegetables like cucumbers and peppers and sprouts, but also any fresh cut fruit or vegetables on the list, as well as seafood, so finfish and crustaceans and mollusks. Tomatoes is one vegetable that I forgot to mention. And the last one that's kind of a more processed food is ready-to-eat deli salads. So
Okay.
Those are all on the list. And the overall requirements for the rule really just fall into 2 major categories. And I'll talk a little bit about the type of records and kind of the enforcement activity on the FDA side. But really what the FDA has done is if you're dealing with a food that's on the food traceability list, they're created really 2 new terms in a regulatory sense: critical tracking events and key data elements. Okay. So the rule basically says if you are involved in holding a food during one of these critical tracking events, which is growing, receiving, processing, which is really broken into 2 categories in the rule, which have slightly different requirements, but creating and transformation are 2 types of processing, or shipping any of those foods, then you're going to be required to keep records that include key data elements per the critical tracking event that you're participating in. So the general summary of the key data elements really revolves around creating traceability lot codes that'll be passed along the supply chain, identifying kind of the quantities of foods that are produced or used as ingredients or shipped or even received has special requirements. That all adds up, as well as some other requirements like location identifiers and location descriptions of where the food was either grown or processed or from where it was shipped. And then the last one for the shipping, which may get overlooked from time to time, is maintaining records of the transporters who are actually transporting the food from your facility. And with that, the overall idea of the program you need to create, you need to have traceability program records, which include kind of a description of relevant reference records that you're using for traceability information. So the FDA has kind of looked at it and said, we don't necessarily need you to create an entirely new program because you already have a lot of these records and things that you're already maintaining. So you may be just referencing bills of lading or purchase orders or production logs to actually get to the information that you need to comply with the rule. And generally, you need to keep a list of any food on the food traceability list that you're handling or dealing with.
Okay.
And then, as I mentioned, you're required to establish traceability lot codes. You have to keep kind of a written policy that explains how are you assigning traceability lot codes. And then the last one that's kind of a catch-all is you need to have anything in your program that explains the data or the records, so someone else can get the data and understand it.
Okay.
So it kind of, and the last thing I guess that I'll mention is records can be paper or electronic. They just have to be stored in a manner that they don't deteriorate or they don't get lost. And then the overall requirement is if FDA requests the records, you have to be able to get them the records as soon as possible or really within 24 hours.
Okay.
And the one caveat to that is if the FDA is investigating or acting on a recall or a product withdrawal or really any food safety outbreak that they're researching or the catch-all, anything involving a public health issue, you have to provide a electronic sortable spreadsheet to the FDA within 24 hours of those records.
Okay. So given all that, which businesses are subject to the rule and which ones are exempt?
That's a bit of a long answer, so I'll start with the basics. So with so many FDA rules, you see they use the term facility as into who's covered by the rule, and then they list all the exemptions. In this rule, they're using the word people or persons who handle, manufacture, process, or pack food. So by using the term persons or people instead of facility, it brings in farms and restaurants to the rule. So it's not your typical facility requirements. It's really trying to get the whole scope of the food chain, because they realize that if every step of the supply chain is not involved in the traceability records, the whole system falls apart. So using that term is anywhere along the supply chain from farm to fork, including the retail establishments and restaurants and grocery stores, things like that. And as with most FDA rules, there's a long list of exemptions that I kind of wrote them down to summarize them, and we won't get into all the details, but the first one being small originators. So these are very small companies. So the general standard is if you have less than $25,000 in annual sales, you're going to be exempt. So not a huge category there. And I mentioned shell eggs as being covered by the rule. If you have less than 3,000 laying hens, that fits in the definition of a smaller originator. Other ones out there include farmers that are selling directly to the consumer. There is a rarely consumed raw aspect similar to the produce safety rule, that if the product's just rarely consumed raw, it's not going to be covered. I think that one's a little bit useless, because if you look at the food traceability list is where you need to start on whether you're covered at all. There aren't really a lot of things that are rarely consumed raw on that list. And so they're not likely to get on the list to begin with, but that exemption is there. And tied in with that one, if you have a process of any of the foods on the food traceability list that reduces microorganisms, pathogens to a acceptable level, so typically like a 5-log reduction, those are exempt. But the important thing to note there is they're only exempt after the treatment is applied.
Oh, okay.
So if you have a product that's on the list, you're required to keep the traceability records up until that validated kill step's applied. And after that, you just have to be sharing that validated kill step down the supply chain, not necessarily all the different key data elements that may apply. Retail establishments, small retail establishments, which is defined as having less than 10 or fewer full-time equivalents. They may be exempt or may be partially exempt. So the proposed rule didn't actually get a final determination on this. FDA wanted to hear people's thoughts. So they really proposed two options and they're waiting on the comments, and we'll know about this in the final rule. So if you have your retail establishment with 10 or fewer full-time employees, you're either going to be fully exempt or just exempt from that electronic sortable spreadsheet requirement that I mentioned.
Oh, okay.
Then I did mention transporters. They're kind of included in the rule is that the shipper or receiver is going to have the name of the transporter, but the actual transporter doesn't have to keep records under this rule. They would be exempt. And then some of the other ones that are out there are nonprofit food establishments, they're exempt. Any food you're using for personal consumption, so you don't have to keep these records in your house, or even if you're having a dinner party, I guess. But then what another unique one is persons who hold food for individual consumers if they're not parties to the transaction and they're not in the business of distributing food. So a food delivery person would be covered, but let's say like the person who is the concierge at your hotel or your apartment building, or your receptionist at the office or something that holds the food for a small time while they're waiting for you to come get it, there's a specific exemption for those folks. And then there's a few partial exemptions out there. So for commingling raw agricultural commodities or RACs, this is one that is really going to apply to largely the shell egg aspect of the rule, because produce that's covered by the produce safety rule is excluded from this exemption. So they're not likely to get that overall exemption. Then retail establishments purchasing food directly from a farm, farm to school programs and farm to institution programs, and some fishing vessels will have a partial exemption as well for some processing that's done on the ship. But so overall, if you're in the supply chain, there's a good chance this rule is going to affect you. But if you dig into the exemptions, there may be some exclusions that kind of modify the requirements for you.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much, Eric, for providing our audience with a review of the proposed rule and what's currently in the rule and all the explanations of who's in and who's out. It does get rather complicated. And thank you, viewers, for joining us today. If you do have questions on the traceability rule or whether or not you're ready for its finalization, feel free to contact Eric or any of TAG's experts for assistance. And as always, be sure to click subscribe to stay up to date on all things food safety and public health from TAG experts. Thanks again, Eric.
Thank you, Lisa.